It is my great honor to open and chair the Belmarsh Tribunal here at Church House, at the center, at the heart of Westminster, at a place where the meetings of the Parliament of the United Kingdom were being held during World War II, and also a place where the first meeting of the UN Security Council was held. But we are not only in London today, we are everywhere in the world, not only thanks to the internet, but also thanks to millions who are ready to fight injustice and demand justice. What and whom are we putting on trial? The bloody crimes that have been committed by Western governments, the United States, but also the United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden, Ecuador under Lenin Moreno, and other governments, the CIA, the NSA, and the military-industrial complex. From war crimes to crimes against journalism and civilians, and crimes against publishers like Julian Assange. We are here so that torture, secret killings, rendition, surveillance, character assassination, and real assassination won't be forgotten and will be put on trial. To whom are we presenting this investigation? As Bertrand Russell said, answering the same question about the Russell-Sartre Tribunal, we are presenting it to the conscience of humankind. And today we should add, we are presenting it to all the women and men, mothers and fathers, children and future lawyers, current politicians and journalists, judges, and all those who will come in our wake. What do we expect of this tribunal today? We came to London in time of disorder. We came to London in time of turmoil, and we are presenting our evidence and accusations to you, and to those who shall resurface following the flood in which we might perish. We know very well no tribunal can bring justice to the victims of war crimes. I incidentally come from a country which went through a bloody war after the collapse of Yugoslavia. Yes, there was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former of Yugoslavia at The Hague, and of course its rulings brought some satisfaction to the families of the victims. But it is enough to come to ex-Yugoslavia to see former war criminals being successful businessmen. Well, you don't have to go to ex-Yugoslavia. You can come to the United Kingdom and find Tony Blair. Or you can go to the United States and you will find plenty of them, war criminals who have never been put on trial. So what do we expect of the tribunal today? Our position is strong because we do not seek to send a few individuals to prison. Jean-Paul Sartre said of the Russell-Sartre Tribunal, but to reawaken in public opinion at an ominous moment of our history the idea that there can be policies which are objectively and legally criminal. Now imagine a capital city in Western Europe, in the heart of so-called Western civilization, whatever this means. You probably remember Walter Benjamin, who said that every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. Imagine a journalist who was for 7 years entrapped in an embassy of a country that was friendly to him. But times changed, and he became an enemy to almost every country. For what? For speaking the truth and revealing the dirty and monstrous crimes of the military-industrial complex. Then he was put in a high-security prison together with terrorists and fundamentalists, and then it was revealed that another country, not Saudi Arabia or Russia, but the United States of America, would kidnap him or kill him at the soil of that capital, just opposite to Harrods, yes, here in London. And still, a British court is still deciding whether to extradite these journalists precisely to the United States, and this is nothing more but assassination in broad daylight. So, since the Russell-Sartre Tribunal was started by philosophers, and I happen to be one, as distasteful as it is to describe oneself as a philosopher, you will allow me a philosophical reference. All of you here, and I'm sure the judges who are watching us, who will decide on Julian Assange's fate, will remember the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato in 399 BC. What was Socrates charged of? There were two charges. The first charge was that he was corrupting the youth. And the second charge was the charge of aceibia, of not believing in the gods of Athens. He could have escaped, just like Julian Assange, but he didn't, and the jury condemned him to death. So what does Socrates say at the moment when he's being accused that he's corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the Parthenon? He says the following sentence: "This is my first appearance in court of law at the age of 70, well, not many could say that, and so I am a complete foreigner to the language of this place." And I think this is a very important sentence. He asked the Athenian judges, whom he sometimes calls the Athenians, to treat him like a foreigner, like a xenos. The great French linguist Émile Benveniste reminded us that xenos would later in Latin become hostis. This is also the source of the English word hostile, while in the original ancient Greek meaning, it meant at the same time foreigner and guest, someone who still had some rights. And it was also the right of hospitality. So Socrates says that he is not even treated as a foreigner, as a xenos. In front of the nomos, the law, he was treated as an enemy, as hostis. Julian Assange, together with Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Daniel Hale, and many other courageous truth-tellers, finds himself in the most respectable company of Socrates. And it is not just Socrates who was accused of aceibia. The list is long. Aeschylus, Anaxagoras, Aspasia, Aristotle, who fled before the trial, and Protagoras, who was sentenced to death or exile. So if the British judges decide either to extradite Assange to the US or to keep him in the British Guantanamo, they will basically condemn him to death. To conclude and to launch, and it's my great honor to launch the Belmarsh Tribunal today, let me quote the great German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said, "Sad is the country which needs heroes." Today we should say, sad is the world that needs Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Daniel Hale, Julian Assange, and so many courageous publishers and whistleblowers. It is sad because it means something is deeply wrong with our world, but we are lucky to have them. And we are lucky to have the following members of the Belmarsh Tribunal today with us, either in person or on screen: Tariq Ali, Renata Avila, Afsana Begum, Richard Burgon, Jeremy Corbyn, Rafael Correa, Oslem Demirel, Deepa Govindarayan Driver, Daniel Ellsberg, Selai Ghaffar, Heike Hensel, Scott Ludlam, Annie Machon, Stefania Maurizi, Ian McCaskill, John McDonnell, Stella Morris, Edward Snowden, Yanis Varoufakis, Ben Wiesner, and Eyal Weizman. So, without further introduction, let me invite our first speaker, my dear friend and original member of the Bertrand Russell Tribunal, Tariq Ali.
Thank you, Strechko. The Bertrand Russell Jean-Paul Sartre War Crimes Tribunal was set up because the two philosophers publicly stated that the crimes that were being committed during the war in Vietnam were neither being acknowledged nor recognized by the powers that be in the Western world. It was basically directed to the rulers of the United States, but also those who were backing them, which meant all the NATO countries, though no one else had troops there apart from the United States, Australia, and South Korea. And we launched that tribunal. Investigating teams were sent to North Vietnam to experience the war, myself included. And we sat through hours and hours of bombing every single day. I saw with my own eyes the day after they'd bombed hospitals and schools in Thanh Hoa province. So it was a searing experience which really left its mark on me and made me who I am in many, many ways. And the tribunal consisted of intellectuals and historians and lawyers from different parts of the world. They met for 4 weeks in 2 different sessions. After the British Labour government and the French government refused to allow them to meet here, the Swedish Social Democrats, under the leadership of Olof Palme, permitted them to meet in Sweden. Interestingly enough, that is where the meetings of the tribunal took place. Witnesses were assembled. The United States was invited to give evidence and refused and said this was a joke. No war crimes were being committed in Vietnam. A few months later, the huge war crime at My Lai, when they wiped out women and children and it was recorded, became public, and the entire argument against our War Crimes Tribunal disappeared in a flash in the middle of a tragedy. And I don't like to say this, but the recently deceased General Colin Powell, who's been, subjected to massive praise and effusions in the media, was one of the senior officers, not then a general, a colonel, who helped to cover up the My Lai massacre for a long, long time. So criminal enterprises like this are part and parcel of the wars that are waged. Now, Julian exposed another set of wars. Basically, he exposed the so-called war on terror, which began after 9/11, has lasted 20 years, has led to 6 wars, millions killed, trillions wasted. That is the only balance sheet of that war. Nowhere has it redeemed itself or done any good, as we've seen most recently in Afghanistan. So what do you say to people like Chelsea Manning and Julian, who's the principal target of the legal and judicial brutalities taking place, when they reveal stuff which everyone knows it's true, since some of it is on video? Americans bombing Iraqi families, totally innocent, laughing about it, and are recorded killing them. That's a big joke. Well, it isn't a big joke for the millions who've died in the Arab world since these 20 years war began. And Julian, far from being indicted, should actually be a hero. He's not the first, and if they think that punishing him in this vindictive and punitive way is going to change people's attitudes to coming out and telling the truth, they're wrong. They always think this. When whistleblowers come out, they taught it when one of our colleagues today, Daniel Ellsberg, blew the whistle on the crimes being committed in Vietnam and revealed secret Pentagon documents, which the New York Times published. Just like the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Republica published the documents that WikiLeaks released. It wasn't so different. Edward Snowden did what we know, exposing surveillance. Hardly remembered, but important for Britain, was Clive Ponting, a very senior journalist, civil servant at the Ministry of Defense, who exposed the lies on the Falklands War that was being fought. And Clive Ponting was tried mercifully, and fortunately for him, it was a jury trial, and though the charges were very strong, breach of this, breach of that, the jury acquitted him, so he walked free. Julian is unfortunate to be captured by this particular state and its different apparatuses in order to appease the United States of America. He should never have been kept in prison for bail. He should not be in prison now awaiting a trial for extradition. He should be released, and I hope that acts like the Belmarsh Tribunal will help to bring that nearer.
Thank you, Tariq, and thank you for mentioning Afghanistan, which brings us directly to our next member of the Belmarsh Tribunal, which is Selai Ghaffar, the spokesperson for the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan.
Dear comrades and friends, I'm thrilled and honored to join you on this historical tribunal. All Afghans, particularly the families of the war victims, expect the Belmarsh Tribunal to heal their wounds by holding the United States accountable for the thousands of innocent Afghans' lives they destroyed and the future they stole. And I salute the Progressive International for this remarkable initiative. In the wake of the US humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan, everybody asks this question. How did the 2 decades of the US military occupation of Afghanistan under the pretext of fighting terrorism ended with the Taliban terrorists gaining a swift and easy victory in Afghanistan? Well, so far, in my opinion, only one person by the name of Julian Assange possibly had the answer to this mystery. In 2011, he unmasked the truth through a set of documents called the Afghan War Diary, where he exposed the tyrannical US policy in Afghanistan and said that one of the goals behind sustaining the war was to wash money out of the tax bases of the US and Europe through Afghanistan and back into the hands of the transnational security elite. 2 decades of US occupation brought us nothing but ruin and loss of lives. And while the mainstream media tried to portray a rosy picture of Afghanistan, the leaks by Assange and contrary revealed bloody atrocities committed by the US and NATO occupying forces. For instance, in 2007, the US Special Forces dropped 6 2,000-pound bombs on a compound where they believed a high-value individual was hiding. However, locals reported that up to 300 civilians had been killed in this raid. None of the media reported that incident. According to reliable sources, about 241,000 Afghans have been killed by crossfire between the US forces and the Taliban, of whom 48,000 civilians have been killed by US occupation forces in a number of unknown incidents. But in my belief, the real number is much, much higher, as many incidents are not reported and not documented. Well, the US occupation has also inflicted invisible wounds. In 2009, the former Afghan Ministry of Public Health reported that fully 2/3 of Afghans suffer from mental health problems. The war has exacerbated the effects of poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to healthcare, and environmental degradation on Afghans' health. Therefore, US and NATO allies are responsible and accountable for all the past 20 years' misery of our tormented people, particularly our ill-fated women. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be among you all today in this tribunal, and I hope Julian Assange will be free soon. Thank you.
So from Afghanistan, we are back to Church House, the heart of Westminster, and I'm really glad that I can present the next member of the Belmarsh Tribunal, who is a member of UK Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this tribunal, and thank you to all those that have organised it, because it couldn't be more important at a more timely moment. We're just reminded by Tarek of the heroic role played by Clive Ponting in a former generation, doing so much to expose lies and dishonesty. And also, if I may say so, the heroic work of the late Tam Dalyell, Member of Parliament, in doing exactly the same over the Falklands War and others. And following what Salai just said about Afghanistan, I would like to concentrate my remarks about Iraq, if I may. I was a founder member of the Stop the War Coalition, which was founded immediately after 9/11 to try and prevent the bombing of Afghanistan. And it gives me no pleasure to say 20 years later, trillions spent, tens of thousands died, many in exile, including 457 British soldiers who died, that there should be some lessons learned from that. John MacDonald, who's on the tribunal as well, and myself were both members of Parliament during this whole period. And we'd opposed the Afghan war. And then early part of 2002, there began to be various stories planted in various media which sort of suggested that somehow or other Iraq was the same as bin Laden, and Iraq was somehow or other linked up with the Taliban, and we had to be very wary of Iraq, which was quite a stretch for the imagination of quite a lot of people, particularly as not very long before, in the late 80s, Britain had been arming Iraq, and indeed I made myself extremely unpopular with many parliamentary colleagues for opposing arms sales to Iraq in 1988, not long before the Gulf War. And the build-up in 2002 was saying that Iraq was a severe danger. The claim that Iraq housed weapons of mass destruction, the attempt by weapons inspectors to find these weapons of mass destruction, which they were unsuccessful in doing. Indeed, everybody was going to be unsuccessful in doing them because they simply didn't exist. And also the claims that Iraq was within 45 minutes of a major attack on various places, obviously within the region of Iraq, but right over into Western Europe. And what scared me was the gullibility of so many of the media that just swallowed this stuff that was given to them by Downing Street and by many others. I was one of those that organised the enormous demonstration in February 2003 in Hyde Park, the biggest ever demonstration in British history. And if I may quote myself at that big event, I said, if we go to war with Iraq, it will not bring peace, it will bring the wars of tomorrow, the refugee flows of tomorrow, the bitterness, the hatred, and the terrorism of tomorrow. Sadly, every single thing that I predicted then has come to be the case. And so, when many of us challenged what was being said by the government, what was being said in the media about weapons of mass destruction, about the plans of Iraq, and so on, we then later learned through the many inquiries that took place, and ultimately through the Chilcot inquiry, that the role of the security services was enormous in this, and the implications being that when opinions or information arrived at the political heart of the whole operation, if they didn't suit the political narrative being put forward, they were simply sent back to be rewritten. If we have a society where there is secrecy and untrammeled power of government of taking us into war, where there is an unaccountable security service and unaccountable security information that's being put forward, it is extremely dangerous. Therefore, the role of the media and of real journalists is absolutely enormous in that. And Julian Assange has paid a very, very, very high price for his lifelong determination to expose the truth. Why? Is it because he has some idea that he can make himself famous by exposing the truth? Or is it something much stronger and much more moral than that? The belief that by exposing the truth, you can save lives, you can stop wars, and you can make sure that democracies function properly by holding all public officials, elected or unelected, to public account. And that's why the role of Julian Assange in all of this is so important. His information exposed the dishonesty surrounding the claims on Iraq. His information exposed the dishonesty of the continuing reporting of Iraq after 2003, with hidden information about the numbers of people that had died from friendly fire in Iraq, but also the dangers to all journalists, to everyone who believes in free speech, of the concept of the embedded journalist, embedded on an aircraft carrier, sent into a barracks or whatever else, to produce reports that are to the liking of the military. So those of us who want to live in a peaceful world and do not believe that a repeat of Iraq will do anything other than bring about even worse consequences than the Iraq War did, are here because we want to support Julian Assange in the bravery that he's shown and the price that he's already paid for that bravery of ensuring that the whole world knows the truth about it. And as my colleague Tariq Ali was saying earlier, in a different place, in a different country, in a different society, Julian Assange would now be hailed by every aspect of the British media for being a hero, because he's exposing the truth. But because the uncomfortable truths that he exposed have been revealed, he's not in that case. Now, as one who has been a Member of Parliament throughout all this period and was very proud to lead the Labour Party during this period, I thought long and hard about what it is like to be in government when you are challenging those people that are handing you information, which is why I believe that there has to be a War Powers Act in Britain, which is what I placed into both of my manifestos, and there has to be real accountability of all aspects of the security services and the military in the role of their special forces as well. Now, democratically elected politicians are elected to hold government and others to account, and holding people to account is, of course, the political process, but it's also the media. And I think the role that Julian Assange has played in exposing uncomfortable truths is something that he should be very proud of, and all those that work with him and support him should be very proud of, and that's why I'm so pleased to be able to take part in this tribunal today. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks a lot, and we are also very proud to have you among the members of the Belmarsh Tribunal. We are also very proud to have the next speaker, who is the Director of Forensic Architecture and a professor at Goldsmith, Eyal Weizman.
I'm going to speak about an aspect of the wars of terror of this millennium. And to a great extent, I think that drones embody the kind of violence and the paradoxes of this war. And my reference to WikiLeaks' contribution is their 2010 revelation. 2 years earlier, in 2008, Pakistan approved US drone strikes. This image that you see is actually part of the leaked Snowden trove, and it shows an Israeli drone intercepted by British secret services. Drone strikes also connect the violence inflicted in the context of Israeli settler colonial violence in Palestine, with first assassinations in 2000, with the imperial wars of terror in, amongst others, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, starting a year or so later. Drone strikes are interesting also because they are argued as the perfect poison dart, a humanitarian technology allowing for a humanitarian form of violence. So their response somehow to those two terms of international law, proportionality, because they're supposed to minimize collateral damage, and distinction, because they're supposed to be, or always argued to be, more precise than they are. So in a sense, I think that I chose to speak about drone strikes because they embody an important political and philosophical justification at the heart of the terror wars, and that is the principle of the lesser evil, which leads to that, precisely to those humanitarian wars, just as it led in the past to the civilizing missions of high colonialism. And this is why we should also have a pause and think whether the use of human rights principle and international law need to be accepted without reservation. Drone strike also embody another principle confronted by WikiLeaks' work, and that is the destruction of evidence and the insistence on deniability. Until 2012, 8 years into the killing spree along the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier that began much earlier, the CIA could still neither confirm or deny using these weapons. And what helped this deniability is actually the minuscule evidentiary signature of drone strikes. Small holes in a roof that are actually smaller than the pixel size in the satellite images that sometimes we use to look into those areas. So small missile hole in the ceiling would not be seen in the satellite images. The photographic resolution of those satellite images are actually made by a political resolution. US law defined the size of the pixels that we see into those places at 50 centimeters, the size of a human from above. In Israel, there is an exception. It's the size of a car from above. It's much bigger pixel. And under that veil of resolution, crimes are actually committed. So if we look at one of the first videos smuggled out of Pakistan, 6 hands, until it arrived in Islamabad, compose it together as the group I represent here, Forensic Architecture, 30 of us, doing this minuscule evidentiary work on those videos, looking at one of the first documentation of drone strike, marking each one of those shrapnel holes in a wall in a room in which we know 4 people were killed. We don't see the human figures unless we look more carefully and actually see that the gaps within the shrapnel create the shadow of those people killed. Those people received the shrapnel in their body, and the shadow was inscribed on the wall of that building like a photographic film is working. And in a sense, I think that this embody that principle in which small-scale munition, in a case of drone strike, and we've exposed and gave evidence to the use of those poison dart called the Hellfire Romeo, used to strike architecture, that perception of a humanitarian technology is precisely what allowed that violence to proliferate. And for strikes to be continued across the entire cities, towns, and villages of Waziristan, such as in other places in Yemen, Somalia, and Gaza, so that the greater evil is arrived at cumulatively, and arriving at least only from that type of violence, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, 4,000 casualties. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and it's my honor to present the next speaker, also a member of the UK Parliament, Afsana Begum.
Thank you, Chair. It's been long clear that the charges relating to Julian Assange publishing activities must be dropped, and that the UK authorities must reject any notion of the extradition to the US, and that there must be really an end to the suffering and torture of one person for the simple act of telling the truth. And we know that without a doubt, Julian Assange would face a real risk of serious human rights violations if deported to the US. And in fact, the UK government's conduct in relation to Assange has revealed such gross hypocrisy when it comes to any professed commitment to human rights and the rule of law. When just a few weeks ago, it was revealed that only a few years ago, the legal attack on Assange came very close to becoming an actual physical assault, kidnapping, and possibly an attempted murder. Now, US lawyers have repeatedly asserted that this is not a political case, and this revelation in the last few weeks shows that it absolutely is. And questions are indeed needed to be asked as to the role of British authorities on this, and any willingness to participate in this grotesque plan, and to participate in potentially gun battles on the streets of London in the pursuit of Assange in this illegal way. Now, if Julian is extradited to the US, it will have far-reaching human rights implications and set a chilling precedent. We know that any such extradition would have profound consequences for press freedom around the world. And this really goes to the crux of this issue for many, whether or not we support freedom for journalists to publish classified information that is in the public interest. because as has been mentioned already, Assange's whistleblowing activities about illegal wars, mass murder of civilians and corruption on a grand scale have put him where he is now. And many communities across the UK and around the world know this too well. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were unlawful under international law and resulted in large-scale death and destruction, including, as the previous speakers mentioned, human rights abuses committed on a large scale by occupying troops. Those wars have destroyed the lives of so many Iraqis and people in Afghanistan and caused destruction to the regions, but it's also devastated communities in this country as well. Communities such as the Muslim community, ethnic minority communities across East London and up and down the country. And the consequences are felt to this day. I know in my part of the country and in the Muslim community, we know too well that we must never embark on illegal wars and imperialism abroad. And the collateral damage video and the evidence that WikiLeaks and Julian were able to release and provide confirmed to so many of us what we already knew, and what was being done in our names, but began to give voice to communities to be able to begin to hold governments to account properly as well. Now, since the Iraq War, we've seen extraditions, renditions, and the work of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange helped expose that. But we know our state's actions have helped foster the climate of hostility at home as well. And in the last 2 decades, we've seen our communities being spied on in our schools, in our mosques, in our universities, and this government's approach, increasingly being draconian, authoritarian, is seeking to strip away the freedoms that so many communities hold dear. And we've seen that on clampdowns on dissent, particularly in the last 12 months, whether that's been bills such as the Spy Cops Bill or the policing bill trying to curb protest. And so it's in this context that it's really hard not to understand the appeal against the verdict and the verdict earlier this year on extradition as another iteration of the expansion of international state suppression of people and the criminalization of journalism. And it was clear that we were misled then, and even now the truth continues to be obscured and suppressed. And legislation by successive governments have continued to assault our human rights in an even more emboldened way. Those that pursue Assange for publishing information about serious human rights violations and those responsible for these crimes continue to enjoy impunity. And we should never forget that the perpetrators are state actors or agents of the state, and that is why Julian Assange is a threat, and other publishers who do the same are a threat. They are a part of people trying to hold those in power accountable. And of course, those in power don't like that. And Assange's case is so important to us all because it's about people power versus state power and imperialism. And it's about truth versus deceit and cover-ups. And it's about seeking justice in an all too often unjust world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Our next speaker and member of the Belmarsh Tribunal is Özlem Demirel, a member of the European Parliament.
Dear friends, I'm happy to be with you today, even when the subject we have to talk about is sad. Today we have to talk about war and war crimes, about the truth and lies. Yes, when we talk about wars in these days, we have to talk about the reasons and justifications for wars. It is European history that has shown the world what armament and militarized competition for markets and resources leads to, this First and Second World War. And this is the reason, the real reason, even today for wars. And these reasons were not accepted by the people. So, at the beginning of wars, we have heard other justifications by our governments. It was said that the war on Afghanistan, for example, was about values, human rights, or the freedom of women. It was said that it was about nation building and democracy. Never it was said that it's about power or geopolitical interest. In Iraq, it was said that it's about a dictator and his weapons. Never it was said that it's about oil and economic interests. Even though we surely have no sympathy for these regimes or terrorists, we have to speak out the truth about wars, also from the West. And in these wars, and in all the wars, things are happening that should not happen. When they happen, attempts are made to conceal them. If not already at the beginning of the wars, then at latest, here the role of journalists, whistleblowers, and brave ones who speak the truth is very important. The war in Afghanistan was hypocritical. It cost lives, civilian lives. By drones, civilians had been attacked. Human rights violation had been part, not just by the side of the terrorists or Taliban, also of the other side, even on the side of the West and the NATO countries. In Kunduz airstrike, innocent civilians were killed under German command with American air power. To date, neither victims nor relatives have been compensated. On the contrary, it was rejected. Not only in America's wars, like Afghanistan, also in Mali, where France is the driving force, wedding was turned into a bloodbath with drones. Even after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, after the disgusting IS attack, the US killed again innocent children and a family. But too rarely it is spoken or written about. And this makes independent and critical journalism indispensable. WikiLeaks was an attempt to do this, but Julian Assange has been punished hard for exactly that, and this is not acceptable. If you ask me, war crimes should be in the dock, not journalists, whistleblowers who make the crimes public. The silence of the European Union in the Assange case is not acceptable for me. The European Union pretend to be guided by values and human rights. But could it be the truth regarding the Assange case? No, these are always sacrificed for geopolitical and economical interests. But in the past, present, and in the future, there were, there are, there will be always the brave ones who speaks all the truth out. And the truth will prevail sooner or later.
So we are back to Church House, and our next speaker is a member of the UK Parliament, John McDonnell. Thanks a lot for joining the tribunal.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a member of the UK Parliament, but I'm also in that capacity Secretary of the National Union of Journalists parliamentary group within the United Kingdom Parliament. Our role as a parliamentary group for the NUJ is to protect and promote the rights of journalists within the United Kingdom and to also link with other parliamentarians across the globe to promote the rights of journalists globally. And we have a long record of interventions and representations opposing attempts wherever to suppress the right of journalists to pursue their profession. At the heart of that profession is the ability to report the truth, to expose wrongs, and in doing so, to enable lessons to be learnt so that those wrongs are redressed and possibly egregious acts prevented in the future. And it's been in the United Kingdom at least, it's been a 400-year struggle from the early pamphleteers of the Civil War to now to establish that right. Journalists have sacrificed their liberty and their lives to secure the right to speak truth to power. This is the country of Tom Paine, the author of The Rights of Man. Inherent was the freedom of expression to the work he undertook. The chair has already mentioned that we are meeting in the building which has hosted in the past the UK Parliament, of also various international bodies who've met to secure in law the protection of human rights, including the freedom of expression. The tragedy is that we now have in the United Kingdom a government that is complicit in the persecution of Julian Assange, which has become now a stain on the history of this country and the people's struggle to secure a free media. And he's being persecuted purely and simply for pursuing the profession of journalism and inherent within that, whistleblowing. His crime, we need to be absolutely clear, his crime is telling the truth, exposing atrocities of war and the brutality of imperialism. He's been hounded by various states, and his life is now threatened by the very states responsible for the war crimes he exposed. I find it the deepest irony that it is these criminal states that are seeking to criminalize the very person who revealed their criminality and its consequences. I visited Julian Assange in Belmarsh Prison. I believe I'm the only Member of Parliament so far that's been allowed to visit him. He's imprisoned in a high-security prison. By all accounts, it is a brutal regime. It's resulted in many harms, self-inflicted amongst the prisoners, including many suicides. I have to say, nobody that endures that regime can do so without having a serious impact upon their health and their well-being. But I found Julian to be bearing up courageously to the regime under which he's been placed. But let's be clear, this is the punishment of an innocent person. And it has an impact beyond the harm to Julian himself. Again, let us be clear, this is a campaign not just to silence Julian Assange, but as a message to all those other journalists out there globally, all those other whistleblowers, to prevent them coming forward in the future. Why has this tribunal been convened? It's because we seek to stand for Julian Assange, to secure his freedom. Julian Assange, the journalist, the whistleblower. But we're also in this tribunal, in doing so, making a stand for the fundamental freedom, the freedom of expression, and the fundamental freedom of journalists to pursue their profession. We stand for fundamental human rights. And if we permit and stand by and allow Julian Assange to be persecuted in this way, have no doubt about it, the fundamental freedoms that we thought had been secured over centuries in the United Kingdom and elsewhere will be at risk.
Thanks a lot. Our next speaker is the former finance minister of Greece, currently a member of the Greek parliament and co-founder of the movement DiEM25, Yannis Varoufakis.
Hello, this is Yannis Varoufakis, feeling deeply honored to be part again of the Belmarsh Tribunal. We live in an era when the 1% of the 1% controls the planet, life, not just humanity, in a manner that has never been seen before. Never before has so much power, exorbitant power, been concentrated in the hands of so very few who are using it so carelessly and very often with destructive effect. What do you do when you have such a huge concentration of power? We can have a revolution. We can change the world. We're trying to, but that takes a while. In the meantime, how do you control primarily the manner in which these supremely powerful forces are controlling what we know, what we see, what we don't know, and what we can't see? A young man in Australia a long, long time ago, well before we ever knew about WikiLeaks, had an idea. The idea of using Big Brother's technology to create a large digital kind of mirror to turn to the face of Big Brother, so as to enable us to be able to watch him watching us, a bit like turning the mirror to the face of the Medusa. WikiLeaks is based on that idea. I remember spending a very long night with Julian in the Ecuadorian embassy in Knightsbridge when he called upon me to help him decipher and transcribe a conversation between officials of the International Monetary Fund. Having spent in the previous year a very long time negotiating with them, listening to them on that tape that Julian had procured through WikiLeaks, through this blind digital postbox, was such a splendid experience. It was so liberating because I could suddenly hear with my own ears the very same officials effectively agreeing with everything that the good people of Greece were saying, that we were saying, that I had been saying to them. Now, of course, WikiLeaks has done far more important work than simply revealing that the International Monetary Fund knew that they were committing crimes against the Greek people and other peoples in Latin America and so on, while perpetrating them. WikiLeaks and Julian, as we know, are being persecuted for revealing to the world, especially to liberals, Democrats, Tories, Social Democrats, revealing to them the crimes against humanity perpetrated by our own elected leaders in our name, behind our backs. This is why they are now killing Julian Assange. So our message as the Belmarsh Tribunal must not simply be one of support for Julian or a call to have him released. No, we are a tribunal. We are trying the criminals that are killing Julian as we speak for crimes against humanity, not just for the crime of slowly murdering Julian Assange. You're criminals, and we're going to pursue you to the end of the earth and back for the crimes you're committing all over the world against humanity, while also murdering slowly Julian Assange and other whistleblowers who are revealing your crimes. This is our job as the Belmarsh Tribunal. We must be brave and we must not mince our words. At the same time, we must remember, especially those of us who happen to be white and male, that there are many non-white, non-male whistleblowers out there all over the place, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, even in the West, whose names we don't even know, and who are suffering as we speak, who've been murdered, who've been incarcerated. And we must act on their behalf as well. The Belmarsh Tribunal must act in order to persecute and to prosecute their murderers, their torturers. I'm Yanis Varoufakis, representing DiEM25. I'm in Athens. I wish I were with you. The Belmarsh Tribunal is a serious contribution to international justice, to the extent that we continue not to call simply for the release of Julian Assange, which of course we do, but to the extent that we continue to persecute and to prosecute those murderers who are acting on behalf of the 1% of the 1%. Carpe diem.
Thanks a lot, Yanis. So now from Athens, from the Greek Parliament, we are traveling to the German Bundestag, and I'm very honored to have a member of the German Parliament with us today, Heike Hensel.
Dear friends and colleagues, my name is Heike Hensel. I'm member of German Parliament. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important event of the Belmarsh Tribunal. The so-called war on terror, declared by then President George Bush, has now lasted for 20 years. The war in Afghanistan lasted just as long. In Afghanistan, NATO has experienced the greatest defeat in its history. The Afghanistan war, which was launched without a UN mandate, was not only a disaster for NATO, but a big crime against the Afghan people. The Boston University Costs of War project estimates the death toll in Afghanistan and Pakistan at least 243,000 people. According to a study by the medical organization IPPNW, the number of indirect casualties could be far higher, at more than 800,000 dead. More than 4 million people have been forced to flee, and Afghanistan remains one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. The German government alone accounts for at least 17.5 billion euros for the war, and the US is at over $2 trillion for direct war costs. The parliamentary group Die Linke in the German Bundestag is lobbying for a committee of inquiry in parliament to look into the 20-year Afghanistan mission and also to investigate possible war crimes committed by the NATO troops. For this purpose, the information revealed by WikiLeaks in the Afghan war diaries is invaluable. It is a disgrace for Europe that the journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, has been locked up innocently in the British high-security Belmarsh prison for over 2 years now, solely to secure his possible extradition to the US, where he faces 175 years in prison for revealing US war crimes. Belmarsh Prison, which has gained additional notoriety from the new James Bond film for its extreme prison conditions, as shown in the film. Those who started the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, violating international law, would have to sit there. Julian Assange must be released immediately, and extradition to the US must be prevented. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe already called on member states to do this in January 2020 in a resolution on media freedom after a corresponding amendment was adopted by consensus. Even after Brexit, the UK will remain bound to the European Convention on Human Rights and the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. They guarantee Julian Assange the right to a fair trial and protection from torture and inhuman treatment, which are threatened in the UK currently and especially after extradition to the United States. Consequences must finally be drawn from this resolution. I therefore appeal to the European Union and the German government to protect the rights of Julian Assange, to defend press freedom on European territory, and to work for his release, especially in view of new publications about murder plans of the CIA against Julian Assange. This again impressively shows the criminal energy behind the political prosecution of Assange. So does the fact that US prosecutors have been using shady board witnesses like Torderson against Julian Assange. Thus, a significant part of the prosecution case also collapses. On October 27-28, therefore, nothing can stand but the immediate release of Julian Assange. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well for your contribution to the Belmarsh Tribunal. Well, I didn't watch the new James Bond movie, but I had the unfortune, or rather fortune, because he's also my friend, to visit the Belmarsh prison. And just to say, for those who still wonder why is the name of our tribunal Belmarsh Tribunal, we named it after the prison where Julian Assange is being held, so that everyone remembers the name of the prison, and so that hopefully he is released soon. We are coming to our next member of tribunal, who is also a member of the UK Parliament, Richard Burgon. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. From its inception, modern colonialism and imperialism arrived dripping in blood, violence and slaughter. From the wiping out of millions of the original inhabitants of what is now Latin America, to the slave trade and the later carving up of Africa, profit has been squeezed, drop by drop, out of human suffering. Later, empire took new forms as the United States became the most powerful nation on earth, and which Martin Luther King described as, and I quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, a remark he made about the Vietnam War that left millions of Vietnamese dead. But a remark that could have been made about the 2003 Iraq War, which left many, many hundreds of thousands dead. Of course, that war was part of a new era of conquest for oil and control across the Middle East, which 10 years ago also led to the seldom discussed US-led invasion of Libya, which Barack Obama once boasted deposed a despot at the cost of less than what we spent in 2 weeks in Iraq. But the human cost was much greater for the Libyan people. Libya's human development indices, once the highest in the region, have collapsed. Human trafficking networks thrive in the anarchy as warring factions vie for control of the economy. Slavery markets have appeared where black people are sold to the highest bidder to work in factories. As one account in Time magazine described, by the time his Libyan captors branded his face, Sunday Cabarot had already run away twice and had been sold 3 times. The gnarled scar that covers most of the left side of his face appears to show a crude number 3. His jailer carved it into his cheek with a fire-heated knife, cutting and cauterizing at the same time. This is the Libya of 2021, not 1821. So where are the trials of those who organized these wars, embarked upon, as they were, with complete contempt for international law? Where is the justice for these victims of 21st century slavery? And today, where is the justice for those being deliberately starved to death in Yemen by that most loyal Western ally, Saudi Arabia? That war has already caused nearly 250,000 deaths, and that includes 130,000 deaths from indirect causes such as lack of food, as Saudi Arabia uses hunger as a weapon of war alongside the arms sold to them from the West. Yet the United States, despite talk from Biden about breaking with some of Trump and Obama's backing for this Saudi war, still refuses to demand an immediate end to the Saudi blockade of Yemen. And regrettably, Britain, along with the United States, has been involved in too many unjust wars in recent years. Wars of conquest, for control, for oil. Much of what we know about these crimes was exposed by the fearless work of a journalist whose award-winning journalism was carried out here in Britain. A journalist who has exposed unlawful killing. A journalist who exposed US rendition and the crimes of Guantanamo Bay. A journalist who is now held in a UK high-security prison solely because of his journalism. What an indictment of the world that we live in, where those who pursue wars are decorated and celebrated, whilst those who expose war crimes face extradition to the United States and the rest of their life behind bars in a super maximum security prison. The world needs more Julian Assanges. The world needs more Edward Snowdens. The world needs more of the fearless journalism of WikiLeaks. Because, as Julian himself once remarked, if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth.
Thanks a lot. Before we switch to the next speaker and member of the tribunal, we will have a short interlude, which is a sort of evidence. And I invite everyone who is watching us today to closely look at the people who appear in this short video which we will show. Some familiar faces from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden. And then I invite you to look at the people who are here today in the room. I invite you to look at the people who are with us at the Belmarsh Tribunal, and I invite you to look at the courageous supporters of Julian Assange and other whistleblowers, and choose your side.
High-tech terrorists.
Cyber terrorists.
Information terrorism.
Shut it down.
We're going to hang you.
Use a drone or something. A bullet in the brain.
Illegally shoot the son of a...
Information warfare is warfare. And Julian Assange is engaged in warfare. Information terrorism, which leads to people getting killed, is terrorism. And Julian Assange is engaged in terrorism. He should be treated as an enemy combatant. WikiLeaks should be closed down permanently and decisively.
Should the United States do something to stop Mr. Assange?
We're looking at that right now. The Justice Department is taking a look at that. I would argue that it's closer to being a high-tech terrorist than the Pentagon Papers.
This disclosure is not just an attack on America's foreign policy interests. It is an attack on the international community.
The head of WikiLeaks is not a particularly credible source in my mind. He is a, in my mind, he's a criminal, and he ought to be hunted down and grabbed and put on trial for what he has done here.
I think the man is a high-tech terrorist. He's done enormous.
Assange.
Yeah. He needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and if that becomes a problem, we need to change the law.
Well, I think Assange should be assassinated, actually. I think Obama should put out a contract and maybe use a drone or something.
You don't want to act panicked and have the
Well, you don't have to act
panicked.
You can act tough and say, if we catch you, we're going to hang you.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
We heard some of that from Holder.
Julian Assange is a cyber terrorist in wartime. He's guilty of sabotage, espionage, crimes against humanity. He should be killed.
How is it that the WikiLeaks guy remains free? You know, back in the old days when men were men and countries were countries, this guy would die of lead poisoning from a bullet in the brain, and nobody would know who put it there.
The way to deal with this is pretty simple. We got special ops forces. I mean, a dead man can't leak stuff. This guy's a traitor, a treasonous, and he has broken every law of the United States. The guy ought to be, and I'm not for the death penalty, so if I'm not for the death penalty, the only one to do it, illegally shoot the son of a...
It's time that the Obama administration treats WikiLeaks for what it is, a terrorist organization whose continued operation threatens our security. Shut it down. Shut it down. It is time to shut down this terrorist organization, this terrorist website, WikiLeaks. Shut it down, Attorney General Holder.
And we are back at Westminster. The next one who will testify is a Pulitzer-winning journalist, someone who spent more than 2 decades at The Guardian. This is Julian McCaskill, and I'm really glad that you joined the Belmarsh Tribunal.
Thank you. As you said, I was on The Guardian for 22 years, and throughout that time, I owe a big deal to whistleblowers. It was interesting seeing these interviews in the last few minutes. I was in Washington at the time, and I covered some of those meetings, and I came face to face with some of those critics. I was part of the Guardian team at the time that covered the diplomatic cables. Another whistleblower that I owe much to is Edward Snowden. I went to Hong Kong in 2013 with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, and spent over a week holed up with Snowden in a hotel room in Hong Kong. Whistleblowers are essential to good journalism. They allow reporters to get behind the walls of secrecy the walls of secrecy built up by officials and press officers. The whistleblowers reveal abuses and wrongdoing within governments, companies, the military, intelligence agencies. These whistleblowers should be rewarded for their courage. Instead, too often they end up facing prosecution or jail. There's been a war being waged against journalism and free speech, and it's been going on since at least 9/11. It's not a general war. It's a specific to national security and the intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies are waging it to try and dissuade future leakers within the agencies and try and dissuade the journalists covering the national security beat. And this is what Assange has been caught up in. What Assange has been accused of is fundamentally no different from the normal interaction between whistleblowers and journalists on the national security beat. There's no fundamental difference between what Julian Assange was doing and what I was doing. When I was in Hong Kong with Snowden, I spent a week with him discussing the ins and outs of his work at the National Security Agency. I spent a week going through tens of thousands of secret documents. He passed me a memory stick with tens of thousands of secret documents on it. I mean, how is that fundamentally different from the relationship between the whistleblower Chelsea Manning and the publisher Julian Assange? Part of the reason is Assange is viewed as an easy target. There is a reluctance on the part of the US or the British governments to take on media organisations like the New York Times or the Guardian. Then it ends up as an argument about press freedom. So they go for the easy target, and that was Julian. If Julian is to be prosecuted, then there's an equally good case for the editor and journalists in the Guardian or New York Times, Der Spiegel, El País, La Repubblica, and all the other organisations involved in this coverage being prosecuted too. Obama, in spite of his liberal background, failed to stand up to the pressure from the intelligence agencies. He used the draconian 1917 Espionage Act and other laws against whistleblowers and journalists. In fact, Obama was responsible for more prosecutions and action against journalists and whistleblowers than all the other presidents in the US combined. And it's not been particularly different in Britain either. The Official Secrets Act that's been revised at present, under the proposed reform, journalists can be prosecuted for publishing leaked intelligence. Just one quick footnote hasn't been mentioned so far. I'd like to thank Assange for sending Sarah Harrison from WikiLeaks to Hong Kong and helping get Edward Snowden out of Hong Kong to the safety of Russia. Otherwise, Snowden would be suffering the same fate as Assange. I hope that the courts show some backbone and resist this attempt to extradite him.
Thank you a lot, and thank you a lot for mentioning Sarah Harrison. We should also mention Jacob Appelbaum and many others who worked with WikiLeaks and whose lives are in a way still in danger. And it would be been great if a country like UK could greet them here at this tribunal, but unfortunately this is not the case. Our next member of the tribunal is joining from Australia. He's a former Australian senator, Scott Ludlam.
Hi, I'm Scott Ludlam, and I'm speaking to you from Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales in Australia. I'm honoured to be able to speak at this tribunal today. where collectively we will make clear that the wrong people are being punished for the crimes of the powerful. Events like these allow us to pause and remember the bigger picture. Remember that we're not fighting a single injustice or an individual despot, but something systematic. Today we hear of the torture camp at Guantanamo Bay. Today we hear about war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, of white-collar crimes in Geneva and Washington, D.C., unpunished crimes from Nairobi to New York. Speaking of the broadest scope of what he found in the State Department cables, Julian Assange said that only by approaching this corpus holistically, over and above the documentation of each individual abuse, each localized atrocity, does the true human cost of empire heave into view. So we've come together to speak of the true human cost of empire, and today our eyes are on some of the accomplices who have allowed these abuses to fester in the dark. Anybody who's been following the extradition proceedings against Julian Assange will understand that this is a calculated abuse of the court system, calculated to wear him and his supporters down in an endless cycle of appeals and counter-appeals, where the prosecution gets what it wants, no matter the result. Because no matter the result, Julian Assange remains in prison, unable to speak for himself. A form of judicial warfare that the UN Special Rapporteur confirmed amounted to torture, all the while seeding the public debate with disinformation and character assassination. Our growing global movement and our presence here today means that this disinformation campaign has failed. Julian's continued defiance from behind the walls of Belmarsh prison means that this torture campaign has also failed. So this is the first essential step to protecting the right of publishers everywhere to tell the truth about the crimes of the powerful. President Joe Biden, drop the appeal. Julian wrote this to a supporter in 2019. Knowing that you are out there fighting for me keeps me alive in this profound isolation. For us, knowing that he's in there still fighting must be our motivation to bring this campaign to a conclusion, so that he can see sunlight for the first time in years, and be with his family and his friends and supporters to recover from the harsh cruelty that he has survived, and to start the next chapter of his life and work. Free Julian Assange.
Thank you, Scott. Our next member of the tribunal, and I'm really glad that she's here in person, is Deepa Govindarayan Driver, who is a lecturer, a trade unionist, and a legal observer at Julian Assange's extradition hearings. So I think at this moment it would be very useful and great if we could hear about your experience. How did these extradition hearings actually look like, and why could they also present a sort of legal crime? If I'm not using too harsh words, but I'm a philosopher, so you will forgive me.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I am testifying to this tribunal about what I observed and what I have been made aware of in the case of a journalist and publisher who has revealed corruption in Kenya, murder, rape and torture in Iraq and Afghanistan, toxic waste dumping off the Ivory Coast, systematic manipulation of the law and state-sanctioned torture at Guantanamo, and of course the role of other so-called advanced Western democracies in subverting democracies all over the world and sustaining war and torture, and for the purpose of increasing weapons sales and intelligence operations. States across the world have a long history of extolling human rights and supposedly supporting press freedom while willfully interpreting or misinterpreting the law to silence dissidents. We see this today in the case of Daniel Hale, entombed at the Communication Management Unit in the US, and Stephen Donziger, who was under house arrest and now sentenced to prison, and of course, closer to home in the case of Craig Murray, sitting in a Scottish jail during a COVID outbreak. In the case of Julian, what I have witnessed has, against the grandeur and the beauty of the beautiful courts and the formality of the courtroom and the respect shown and the deference shown to the judges, is cruel treatment. Now, this cruel treatment goes back a long way. It includes isolation and confinement. deprivation of sunlight and association, a huge amount of physical and emotional trauma, which then turns into degrading treatment in the courtroom where the defendant, who is known to have a serious mental health condition as a result of 5 nation-states stamping virtually on his head, and having to kneel in the courtroom, given that he is somebody who has osteoporosis, and speak to his lawyers through a small gap in the plexiglass. It is seen in being given a laptop with the keys glued down so that he is able to, so that they can pretend that there is a defense being mounted in this case, when actually he is not being given the right to talk to his lawyers in any depth. He is denied his glasses for a period of 3 months when he first entered Belmarsh, and he, of course, has serious neurological and other symptoms, including the lasting effects of physical torture, for example, from a shoulder injury which took place since 2012, and teeth injury which has taken place. You know, many of us know how painful it is to have a sore tooth, but to have your tooth pulp exposed and not to be allowed to leave the embassy to get medical treatment is indeed cruel and inhumane treatment. He also experiences, of course, hypervigilance and flashbacks, and these are the result of a continuous and long smearing campaign which has been sustained through lawfare, where accusations and court processes have been kept in limbo to prevent justice. And the British state has been very complicit in this, including Keir Starmer's CPS. We're also interested in, of course, the complete and utter denial of access to the attorneys under the guise of the pandemic to prevent Julian from even receiving the documentation or being served the second superseding indictment until the first day of trial. The constant contesting of the use of witnesses, and the judges engaging in many arbitrary detentions, the serious conflicts of interest that we can see amongst judges who have a son who is linked to Darktrace, which is a company that militates against data leaks, and who has a husband who is deeply connected to the military establishment. We are concerned about judges who cause people who are like 90-year-old Daniel Ellsberg to be called at 4 a.m. in the morning or 5 a.m. in the morning in the US to provide testimony when there are other time slots available. We're also concerned about other clearly despicable processes, such as we have seen in the case of Abdel Rahim al-Dashiri in Guantanamo, where a mic was placed in his room, and a similar thing being done in relation to Julian in the use of laser microphones to spy on privileged legal conversations, to spy on medical conversations, and to prevent Julian from having any reasonable chance to defend himself. And lastly, the presence of a process which seems to provide a semblance of justice when actually what is taking place in these courts is a complete and utter travesty and an injustice. And I urge you to stand with everybody on this tribunal as we watch the war criminals, as we watch the judges, and as we watch those like Julian, Craig, and others who stand up for the truth and stand up for us, because torture is aimed at destroying not just individuals, but also the will of communities. We stand together against this torture and against the ill treatment and dehumanization of Julian Assange.
Thanks a lot for your important contribution, and thank you for reminding us that Julian Assange, during the hearings, is entrapped, caged in plexiglass. So I guess everyone here might remember who was the other one famous person, a war criminal, who was also in a glass cage. It was Adolf Eichmann, a war criminal guilty of genocide. And on the other side here in the UK, which tells a lot about the legal system in this country, you have a whistleblower, a publisher, a journalist put in a glass cage through which he cannot even communicate to his lawyers. so much about the legal system in the UK. The next speaker and member of the tribunal is Renata Avila, a human rights lawyer and formerly also a lawyer of WikiLeaks. Thanks, Renata, for joining.
Good afternoon. My name is Renata Avila. Today, the 22nd of October of 2021, we are gathering here at the Belmarsh Tribunal to discuss, to study carefully, and to denounce to the world a series of human rights violations perpetrated against Julian Assange by the government of the United States and the government of the United Kingdom, with the assistance of their allies and with the complicity and silence of many mainstream media outlets. I have been part of Julian's legal team over the last 11 years or more, and over this time, I have witnessed an unprecedented case of lawfare. What is lawfare? Lawfare is when the case is used not, when the law is used to attack, to destroy, to undermine someone, instead of using to protect and defend what is good in society. And what is good in society is to have a free press. And what is good in society is to have freedom of exercising journalism and the right to know and the right to truth. And those are the rights and those are the values that Julian Assange upholds. Even during his arbitrary detention, and that has extended over the years, even in periods of harsh isolation, he had defended and upheld those rights. But there's also another right, together with the terrible violations to his right to work, and his right to a family, and his right to a freedom, and that had been exercised against him. And that has been a massive violation of his privacy, the privacy of his family, the privacy of his friends, and more seriously, the privacy of his lawyers. I experienced that firsthand. To my surprise this year, no authority contacted me, no member of the US prosecution team or the UK prosecution team contacted me to ask me if I wanted to open an investigation, because it was exposed that my computer, that my legal documents, that my files were used against my client in the Julian's process. So not only I had to go in each and every meeting inside the embassy through an unprecedented level of surveillance by private security company and by all the agencies that were, like, as it has been exposed recently by the press, surveilling us, to the degree that I had to whisper in the ear of my client and to scribble things hidden from cameras to communicate and prepare a legal defense in the multiple cases against him. But also, during my visits, my computer was compromised and evidence was handed over to the United States of my files, of my personal information, all information of my client. That violation of ethics, that violation of my right to exercise as a lawyer, to practice in private and to have private discussions with my clients, was completely ignored by two governments. And it should be completely dismissed as evidence. But I don't want to go to the details. What I want to convey today is a strong message from beginning to end, from beginning to today. This case is weak. This case is not a legal case. It's a political persecution and revenge. And the revenge, why revenge? Why revenge if the only thing that Julian did was to expose the truth? It's a revenge because they cannot, the only thing that they can try is to silence him. But we have seen with many revelations over the years, with the crisis in Afghanistan this year, how overwhelming the truth is, how overwhelming and how accurate the information exposed by WikiLeaks was. We have in our hands, and we have this tribunal as a vehicle to expose the unprecedented violation of rights that go beyond the rights of Julian Assange and the legal team and his family and his friends. the violation of rights that we have witnessing today is the violation of your rights, is the violation of your right to know, is the violation of your right to truth, justice, and accountability. I hope this tribunal finds both the government of the United States and the government of the United Kingdom guilty of this crime. And I hope that this sends a very strong message to end this case now. Thank you, members of the tribunal. I'm happy to provide.
Thank you, Renate, as a member of the tribunal, and thank you also for mentioning a very important detail, and this was revealed in El País, that everyone, including the lawyers who were visiting the Ecuadorian embassy in London, were spied on directly or indirectly by the CIA. I wear it as a badge of honor that I was also spied on. And the next speaker, an investigative journalist, one of the best investigative journalists today, Stefania Maurizi, from Italy, was also spied on. Her phones were opened, her computers were opened, people were surveilled, and probably this is not finished yet. But Stefania will speak about another perspective of Julian Assange's case, and thanks a lot for joining us today.
So good afternoon, and I'm honored to be here at the Belmarsh Tribunal. Let me introduce myself. I'm an Italian investigative journalist who has spent over a decade working on all WikiLeaks secret documents. I have done this hard work for my newspaper, initially the Italian leading news magazine L'Espresso, and the Italian daily La Repubblica, and currently for the major Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano. It was only thanks to Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists and their sources, especially Chelsea Manning, that I have been able to reveal crucial information in the public interest, such as war crimes in Afghanistan, in Iraq, tortures in Guantanamo, from Iraq to Guantanamo, extrajudicial killings by drones, political pressures to grant impunity to state criminals involved in the CIA extraordinary rendition program. And it was only thanks to Julian Assange that I was able to reveal how my country, Italy, has become the launching pad for US wars, from Iraq to the secret drone war. I have published thousands of investigations and articles based on such revelation, but while I have been able to do this journalistic work completely safely, I was never arrested, I was never questioned, Julian Assange has been destroyed. Let me use this strong word, he has been destroyed. For me, it has been very, very sad to witness how he has been destroyed, how he has been crushed, destroyed. And the way he has been treated should make you very, very angry. It's a massive scandal. It's not an exaggeration to call it a massive scandal. I'm here to call out the US authorities, the UK authorities, the Swedish authorities, the Australian authorities, and the Ecuadorian authorities under Lenin Moreno for such massive scandal. I have spent the last 6 years fighting in court to access the full documentation on the case under the Freedom of Information laws. I have done this because I think it's crucial to get the facts, to reconstruct the facts rigorously, to have solid evidence. I have been fighting in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, and in Australia. I'm represented by 7 lawyers. I'm doing this work completely alone, just because I don't want these people to win. I want to discover what they have done. I want to unearth evidence of their abusive, horrific treatment of Julian Assange, and I want facts. 4 powerful nations are using all their legal resources to deny a journalist access to the documentation on the case. It means that this documentation is something like dynamite. Had it been bureaucratic correspondence, they would have never spent the last 6 years trying to fighting against my attempt to access it. But in any case, even if I experienced such rubber wall, thanks to this 6 years litigation in US, UK, Sweden, Australia, I was able to obtain some really important documents, very, very few, but indeed very relevant, because they provide indisputable evidence that it was the UK authorities, the UK Crown Prosecution Service, then headed by Sir Keir Starmer, which contributed to create the legal and diplomatic quagmire which has kept Julian Assange arbitrarily detained since 2010 and finally resulted in his arrest and in his detention in Belmarsh. And it was the Crown Prosecution Service which was against the Swedish prosecutors dropping the case in 2013 when they were considering doing so. Why did the Crown Prosecution Service behave like this? Why did they write to the Swedish prosecutors, "Don't you get cold feet"? I'm quoting from official documents. No one can dispute these official documents because they have been provided to me after years of litigation by the UK authorities and other authorities involved in this case. And why did the Crown Prosecution Service write to the Swedish counterpart, "Please do not think that the case is being dealt with as just another extradition request"? When I try to dig into these facts and try to understand why the Crown Prosecution Service had behaved like this, the Crown Prosecution Service gave me a pretty incredible answer. They said they had destroyed the documents about this case. And even if the case was still ongoing, highly controversial and very high profile, it's incredible to me that they destroyed such documents, and it's even more incredible that they don't even know what the document contained. They claim so. They say that they don't know what the document contained. And I have been fighting years trying to discover why they destroyed this document and what the document contained. You have to realize that the Crown Prosecution Service, which was in charge of this attempt to extradite Julian Assange to Sweden, is the very same agency in charge of the extradition to the US. The very, very same agency. The US is acting through the Crown Prosecution Service, and the Crown Prosecution Service has such a record. It's the agency which did this during the Swedish case. It's the agency which destroyed the documents, though the case was still ongoing. It's the agency which claimed they don't even know what they destroyed. So I wonder whether during our litigation, the Crown Prosecution Service made no mystery that they are dealing with this extradition, the extradition of a publisher who revealed war crime, as if they are extraditing a criminal like any other, a drug dealer or perhaps a mafia killer. So it's time to demand transparency and accountability from the Crown Prosecution Service in the handling of the Julian Assange case from the very beginning. And it's time for the journalists, activists, and the public opinion to call out the US and the UK authorities, especially the judicial authorities, for this monstrous injustice. Free Julian Assange, drop the charges, jail the war criminals.
The next to testify is the former president of Ecuador from 2007 to 2017, during whose presidency Julian Assange got the political asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, Rafael Correa.
Señores magistrados, señoras y señores, los saluda Rafael Correa, presidente constitucional de la República del Ecuador desde el año 2007 al 2017. Para mí es un gran honor estar el día de hoy con ustedes en el Tribunal de Belmarsh y contribuir a la verdad histórica, contribuir a la justicia. En junio del 2012, el periodista australiano Julian Assange entró en nuestra embajada en Londres y pidió el asilo del Estado ecuatoriano. Casi 2 meses después, y luego de una profunda investigación, un extenso informe, dicho asilo, en ejercicio de nuestro derecho soberano, fue otorgado, sobre todo fundamentado en que no había las garantías para el debido proceso, puesto que había un riesgo cierto, real, de que Julian Assange fuese extraditado a los Estados Unidos, donde ya había sido condenado por los medios de comunicación y donde querían aplicar una ley que incluía la pena de muerte, pena prohibida en todos los instrumentos interamericanos de derechos humanos, en todos los instrumentos mundiales. Jamás fue nuestra intención interferir con la justicia sueca. Siempre estuvieron abiertas las puertas de la embajada para que se interrogue a Julian Assange. Julian Assange ni siquiera estaba acusado en Suecia. Querían interrogarlo. Eso se puede hacer en la embajada. Lo habían hecho antes. La fiscalía sueca no lo quiso hacer. Al final lo hizo, después de muchos años, 4 o 5 años, demostrándose que siempre pudo interrogar a Julian Assange en la embajada del Ecuador en Londres. Jamás fue nuestra intención interferir con la justicia sueca, pero sí defender los derechos humanos de alguien que había solicitado el asilo del Estado ecuatoriano. En mayo 24 del 2017, entregué democráticamente el gobierno a mi sucesor, Lenín Moreno. Ya el 30 de mayo se reunía con Paul Manafort, ex jefe de campaña de Donald Trump. Esto se conoce porque ustedes saben que Paul Manafort ha sido condenado, se declaró culpable de lavado de activos y otros cargos. Y en esa investigación del FBI de Estados Unidos, varios testimonios indicaron que el 30 de mayo Paul Manafort se había reunido con Lenín Moreno, una semana nada más tenía el presidente Lenín Moreno, en Quito, y que Lenín Moreno había ofrecido entregar a Julian Assange a cambio de financiamiento a los Estados Unidos. Luego, pues, realmente Julian Assange lo que recibió fue una tortura en la embajada ecuatoriana, maltratándolo, quitándole muchos servicios, muchos derechos, comunicaciones, internet, espiándolo deliberadamente y presionándolo para que decidiera salir por sus propios medios de la embajada, lo cual no lograron. Finalmente, después de un acoso brutal, inhumano, atentatorio a los derechos humanos de Julian Assange, por primera vez en la historia, un gobierno permite que entre una fuerza armada a su embajada y la policía británica entra en la embajada del Ecuador para capturar a Julian Assange y el Estado ecuatoriano entrega a Julian Assange. Quiero decirles que esto también contradice totalmente, brutalmente, frontalmente, la Constitución ecuatoriana que dice, leo, artículo 41, se reconocen los derechos de asilo y refugio, de acuerdo con la ley y los instrumentos internacionales de derechos humanos. Las personas que se encuentren en condición de asilo o refugio gozarán de protección especial que garantice el pleno ejercicio de sus derechos. El Estado respetará y garantizará el principio de no devolución. Repito, el Estado respetará y garantizará el principio de no devolución. Artículo 41, Constitución del Ecuador. Este artículo fue destrozado por el gobierno Moreno. Nadie dijo nada a nivel nacional, porque la prensa es cómplice de esto, la prensa ecuatoriana, y a nivel internacional tampoco, ¿no? Porque todo el caso de Julian Assange fue terriblemente politizado. Quiero decirles que yo no conozco personalmente a Julian Assange. No necesariamente. He hablado una vez con él antes del asilo, cuando me entrevistó para Russia Today. Jamás he hablado telefónicamente siquiera con él después de que fue asilado. Y no es que necesariamente concuerdo con todo lo que hizo, pero sí con sus derechos humanos de tener un proceso justo. Y sí estoy totalmente en contra de la doble moral. Sé, como ex jefe de Estado, que los Estados requieren mantener cierta información confidencial, pero no se puede tener en la confidencialidad crímenes de guerra, crímenes de lesa humanidad. Y no se puede perseguir y condenar al que devela esos crímenes, más aún, ser perseguido por los criminales, por los que cometieron esos crímenes. Ojalá se inaugure la justicia, ojalá se ponga fin a tanta doble moral, ojalá se ponga fin al suplicio de un ser humano como Julian Assange, que lo que dijo fue la verdad. Un inmenso abrazo y mucha suerte el mayor de los éxitos en el sentido de que prevalezca la justicia, la verdad en este proceso. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Mr. Correa, and thanks everyone for your patience. We have 4 more members of the Belmarsh Tribunal giving their testimony today. The next one is Annie Machon. I hope I pronounced it well. Blame it on my Balkan origin and my Balkan English. She is a whistleblower and a former intelligence officer of MI5.
It is my very great pleasure to join you today to support Julian Assange and to hope for the best in his legal case. And I come to this area because I myself was a whistleblower many, many years ago, because I used to work in the early to mid-1990s as an intelligence officer for the British Security Service, MI5. And that was where I met my former partner and colleague, a man called David Shaler, who became a very notorious whistleblower in the late 1990s. And by doing so, we automatically broke the draconian terms of the Official Secrets Act in the UK. And we fled the UK, went on the run literally for a month around Europe, lived in hiding in a remote French farmhouse for a year, and then another 2 years in exile in Paris. I and our family and our friends and even some journalists were arrested around the scandal of this case. And David himself paid a very heavy price. He went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British tried to extradite him from France, but failed in 1998. And also when he returned voluntarily and then was put on trial under the Official Secrets Act and went back to prison. So it was a very difficult 7 years. And we had to work exclusively, of course, at that point with the mainstream media, the old legacy media, which, because of various laws in place and various ways that the British establishment can control the mainstream media in the UK, meant that they can sometimes work as a blockage. There was also a slight problem because David took carefully curated documents, nothing containing agent names, to his journalist co-workers. And those documents were held by the newspaper, and those documents were handed over when the police came knocking with a production order. So the proof of what David was saying was lost because of this. So fast forward to 2009, when I first had the pleasure of meeting Julian Assange, and he was describing the vision of WikiLeaks, which was to get rid of that sort of media blockage, the old media blockage, and present information directly from the whistleblower to the citizens so that they could make up their own minds about whatever it was, corruption of intelligence agencies, corruption of government, corruption of big corporations around the world. And for this, rightly, he has been lauded as, 1, a high-tech publisher of incredible vision, and 2, as an award-winning journalist. And this takes me on to his current situation, because he is being persecuted for being a publisher and being a journalist. And yet his vision with WikiLeaks was to protect the whistleblowers and not persecute them, to offer a degree of anonymity, to offer a degree of proof, to show exactly what they were revealing. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have built, both technologically and from a humane point of view, and also as a media outlet. So I salute him for that. However, despite all these awards and all these plaudits, he is not being accorded the same degree of respect as other more mainstream, old-style journalists have been for exposing exactly the same situation. Most notably, what is known in the US as the New York Times example, where they were working at one point very closely with WikiLeaks, producing information that WikiLeaks had given them, and yet they are not being prosecuted, but WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is. We also have another very weird case of a guy called Christopher Steele, who was a former MI6 intelligence officer, who has now set up his own mercenary spy company for hire. And he was the person who created what became known as the dirty dossier on Donald Trump and his visit to Russia, which has been discredited. And he was then sued by some Russian oligarchs in US courts. And he has been accorded US First Amendment rights, which is the freedom of expression. And this basically means that even though he is a UK citizen and resident in the UK, not in America, not a US citizen, he can have First Amendment rights as a journalist and a publisher under US law. And yet this is precisely what is being specifically denied to Assange if he were to be extradited to the USA. This is something I find absolutely disgusting. So I just really want to finish by saying it has been a pleasure over the years to meet with Julian Assange. He is one of the most ferociously bright people I've ever met, but also very good company and incredibly witty and very humane and protective of whistleblowers who might be vulnerable going forward and trying to expose the crimes that their fellow citizens should be able to read about. I really hope in this particular case coming up at the end of October, just for once, that UK justice will prevail, do the decent thing, and release this very brave, very courageous, very visionary and very humane man so that he can try and rebuild his life. And potentially the legacy he's left with WikiLeaks is going to preserve and protect other whistleblowers in the future. So all courage to Julian Assange.
In 1971, Vladimir Dedijer and Jean-Paul Sartre published an article in the New York Times Review of Books where they speak about the importance of Pentagon Papers. 50 years later, I'm really proud to say that one of the greatest whistleblowers in history, Daniel Ellsberg, is joining the Belmarsh Tribunal.
Hi, I'm Dan Ellsberg. 50 years ago, I was the first American to be prosecuted facing the same charges that Julian Assange is facing today. In my case, I'd copied 7,000 pages of top-secret material that realized the history of Vietnam as a history of lies, law-breaking, war crimes, many other things that the government was concerned to conceal from the public. And it was the first such prosecution because having fought a revolutionary war against an empire, a product of that revolutionary war was our First Amendment, which forbids legislation that would abridge freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Obviously, to go against me as a source raised questions about whether that was really constitutional, and that's never been fully decided yet by the Supreme Court, which hasn't addressed that case. But the case against Julian as a journalist obviously contradicts the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press. That's the first prosecution that has gone against the journalist. And if Julian is extradited and prosecuted and probably convicted in our court by recent precedent of new judges in court, that will be the first time that a journalist, but it won't be the last. Every journalist will have a target on his back from that time on, and not only Americans. Julian himself is not American and did not take the oath of an American official to uphold our Constitution, which is violated every time these secrets of crimes and deception and lawbreaking are concealed from the public. If Julian were an American official having revealed this, he would be fulfilling that oath in a way that almost none of his colleagues have ever done. But in my case, there's further analogy. When I was being prosecuted for the Pentagon Papers revelation, which ended in 1968 before President Nixon was in office, who prosecuted me, he was afraid that I had information and documents about crimes he was committing and lies he was making, which I did, although not as much as he feared. But to keep me from revealing that, he took criminal acts against me, illegal, warrantless wiretapping, overheard many times, and even a psychological profile of me by the CIA meant to manipulate me, if possible, and actually sent CIA assets, men who were veterans of the Bay of Pigs operation, to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol in a rally on May 3rd, 1972. They actually didn't do that, obviously, because they feared they were being set up to be caught and backed off from it. But it did show a willingness of the president, the government, actually to commit crimes against an American citizen in order to keep wrongful secrets. Exactly the same has been revealed about Julian Assange. We now know that contractors were carrying out illegal surveillance, even of his talks with lawyers and doctors in the Ecuadorian embassy. Information was going to our covert operations, to CIA, probably to NSA as well. And they even considered seriously kidnapping him or killing him with perhaps poison, just as I say an effort was made, was actually carried out, but not fully, to incapacitate me. In my case, crimes revealed, my case was dismissed. And in fact, they figured in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon, which actually brought Nixon out of office and made the war endable 9 months later. The revelation of these acts against Julian Assange should obviously result in the dismissal of all charges against him. And prior to that, an English judge taking account of this should maintain her forbidding of extradition and reject President Biden's shameful appeal of that order to extradite Julian. Our freedom of the press depends on it. Julian Assange's health very clearly depends on it, but more broadly, our ability to learn the truth about what is being done in our name.
We are coming back here to Westminster, and our next member of the tribunal is the partner of Julian Assange and member of his defense team, Stella Morris. Thanks a lot for being today with us.
Thank you. We're meeting 5 days before before the US appeal at the High Court here in London. And I want to remind everyone that Julian won the case on January 4th, and the Trump administration, 2 days before leaving office, lodged the appeal. And Julian's bail application was refused, so he's been in prison, in Belmarsh prison, for over 2.5 years. And we're meeting in this building where the UN met to construct an international rules-based order, one that was founded and centered around human rights. And we're meeting here to denounce the dismantlement of that international rules-based order, a departure from human rights. And that departure is, Julian's case is emblematic of that departure. And having lived through what has been done to Julian, I especially have a responsibility to try to make this situation understandable and interpretable to everyone else, because it matters to everyone else. Because what's being done to Julian, his rights that are being violated, they're your rights too. And if he loses this, we all lose. So Julian's, what's being done to Julian is part of a continuum that started with the war on terror. A chipping away at individual rights and freedoms. The Extradition Act that is being used against Julian is actually a tool of the war on terror. It was enacted in 2003 to make it easier to extradite people. And we have to see what is being done to him through the prism of the war on terror, the tools that were developed through the war on terror. Julian was the person who, in our generation, has done the most to expose the war on terror. And the war on terror isn't just about illegal wars. It's not just about institutionalizing torture and rendition. It's about bringing home that dismantlement of our rights. Now, in the last few weeks, the mask has fallen in relation to the case against Julian. It's fallen because there was an article, well, it's been progressively falling over the years. There is no case, as others have said. This is just a naked political persecution. But there was an article published by Yahoo News just a few weeks ago, a 7,500-word investigation, with over 30 sources, named and unnamed, high-level sources from current and past US administrations, from the National Security Council, from the CIA. And that story revealed that the extrajudicial assassination of Julian in London was discussed at the highest levels of the US government, that the 7th floor of the CIA in Langley which is the director's office, requested sketches and options for how to kill Julian inside the embassy of Ecuador. They talked about kidnapping him too, about rendition, extraordinary rendition, which is what the CIA developed to kidnap people and take them across jurisdictions, to disappear them and then put them in a black site somewhere. And the embassy was essentially a black site towards the end. I felt that anything could happen there. Julian's lawyers were targeted by name, not just incidentally spied on. There are emails telling the security company to target Gareth Pierce, to target Aitor Martinez, to target Julian's legal team. And their documents were stolen. And Baltasar Garzón's office was broken into, just as the CIA was planning to murder Julian. And our 6-month-old baby's nappy was instructed to be stolen so that they could use that, analyze the DNA to check whether Julian was the father. This is flagrant criminality. We're dealing with criminals who have instrumentalized the law, instrumentalized the extradition arrangements with this country and their good relationships with this country to politically persecute an innocent man, a journalist, for doing his job. It didn't start with Julian, and it's not going to end with Julian. This article, which I recommend everyone reads, said that in 2013, the US government was trying to classify Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, and possibly Ewan McCaskill as well, as information brokers in order to treat them as national security threats. That same year, James Rosen from Fox News was described as a co-conspirator because of his dealings with his source at the State Department, who was convicted of espionage. This continuum that, from the war on terror, it's not just affecting Julian. It's exposed in the attempted reforms to the policing bill in this country, to the attempted reforms to the Official Secrets Act, to the attempted censorship of the internet. Julian's case is not some sui generis thing. It is emblematic of the society we live in, of the undermining of all our freedoms. But we can win this. It's touch and go, but we can win this if we come together to defend our rights, defend Julian's rights, which is defending our own rights. And all the major human rights organizations, all the major press freedom organizations recognize this. They're all calling for Julian's freedom because they can see that this is an attack on press freedom itself, on individual freedoms themselves. Julian is holding back a tide of authoritarianism, and if we win this, we can push back. But if we don't, we won't.
Thanks a lot for your contribution, and we will win this. I'm sure in that. Our next member of the tribunal to testify is Ben Wiesner from the American Civil Liberties Union, and he was also the lead attorney of Edward Snowden. And after Ben Wiesner, we will get Edward Snowden directly live streamed from Moscow. So please stay with us, and let's continue.
Hi, this is Ben Wiesner. I'm an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union in New York. For the last 8 years, I've had the privilege of being the principal legal advisor to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. It's an honor to be with you virtually today for this important event. My brief remarks are going to focus on the threat that the prosecution of Julian Assange poses to press freedom both in the United States and abroad. Recently, a coalition of press freedom groups in the United States petitioned the Department of Justice to drop the extradition request and to drop the charges against Julian Assange because of the existential threat that this prosecution poses to national security investigative journalism. Now, the US government would have you believe that this case does not implicate press freedom because Julian Assange is not a journalist and WikiLeaks is not a traditional publisher. Rather, they engaged in a criminal conspiracy to bring true facts to the public of the United States and the world. Well, I am here to say that all national security investigative journalism, properly understood, is a criminal conspiracy. Good journalists conspire with sources to liberate information from government classification regimes and share it with the public in the public interest in support of democracy. And almost all of the most important stories about US government misconduct in the war on terror we have learned because courageous sources and enterprising journalists have published that information even though it was classified at the highest level of secrecy. So if not for courageous whistleblowers and enterprising journalists, we would not have known that the US tortured and sexually humiliated prisoners in Abu Ghraib, that the CIA operated a network of secret prisons outside the law, that drone strikes routinely killed civilians and not just their intended targets, that the US established a global network of mass surveillance without the consent of the public. These and many other stories we learned only because of that conspiracy, the conspiracy to bring the truth to the public against the wishes of governments. And so there is no meaningful way to distinguish this case, which says that Julian Assange committed a crime by helping to publish evidence of war crimes released to him allegedly by Chelsea Manning, and the kind of national security journalism that routinely wins the highest journalism awards around the world. But I think there's a second reason why this case is a particular threat to press freedom globally that has not received enough attention. And that is that, to me, it is the height of hubris for the United States to suggest in this indictment that our own secrecy laws bind foreign publishers. Mr. Assange is an Australian publisher. He never agreed to be bound by US secrecy law. And for the US to drag him across the ocean into a US prison, into a US court, and charge him with felonies for doing that will set a hugely dangerous precedent around the globe. Every day, journalists from US newspapers, UK newspapers, the New York Times and the Guardian pry loose and publish secrets of foreign governments. The New York Times has in the last years published top secrets from the government of China, from the governments of Iran, and one can imagine how the US government would respond if Iran or China tried to extradite the US reporters or their publishers for having violated those countries' secrecy laws. We would cry bloody murder, and we should. And that's because it makes no sense in this world for each country to be able to bind the rest of the world to our own regressive secrecy laws like the US Espionage Act. And so I worry that if this case is allowed to go forward, if Mr. Assange finds himself in a US courtroom, the next time a country like China or Iran demands the extradition of a French journalist, a British journalist, an American journalist, of course our governments won't comply, but they'll have no principled basis for not doing so. We will have essentially opened the door to every country enforcing its overbroad secrecy regime in this way. So let me close by saying that right now this issue is in the courts. The courts like to believe that they are immune to public pressure and public opinion, but I can assure you that the opposite is true. They are paying a lot of attention to how this case will be received by the public. And if the public is quiet, then they will think that they can move ahead with an extradition and a prosecution. But if the public is loud, and the public says this is unacceptable in our open societies for us to go forward with a prosecution like that, the judges will hear it. So my message to you today is, let them hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now the moment has come to greet a great guest, a member of the tribunal who is joining us live from Moscow. This is Edward Snowden. I'm sure we don't need more introduction who he is. I think everyone knows who he is. And I'm really thankful, Ed, for joining us today and raising your voice at the Belmarsh Tribunal.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's difficult to be here. I struggle to understand how we can be here after so many years. There have been so many stories told. There's been so much criticism. There has been so much deception. And where has it brought us? Has this been constructive? Is this a victory for us, for the state, for humanity, for our rights? When I came forward in 2013, I said the reason that I came forward was that we have a right to know that which is done to us and that which is done in our name by our governments. That was already under threat. And when you look at the world since, it seems that that trend is accelerating. Do we still have that right? Do we have any rights if we don't defend them? Well, today we see someone who has stood up to defend that right, who has aggressively championed that right at an extreme cost. And it's time for us to defend his rights. What we're witnessing is a murder that passes without comment. And I want to say that it is difficult for me to comprehend the spectacle of the press of a nation or the developed world aiding and abetting with full knowledge a crime not only against this man, but against our public interest. However, at this moment, that we all see this, we all feel it. It's no less familiar than the shoes on my feet. Everywhere we look, from Afghanistan to economics, from pandemic to pervasive surveillance, the obvious has been made unspeakable. It has become unspeakable because the truth of our circumstances could be taken as evidence in the defense of the actions of the out of favor. And in the eyes of the American state, few represent this class, a greater object of hatred than the person of Julian Assange. He has been charged as a political criminal, something that I understand quite well, but he has been charged as the purest sort of political criminal for having committed the transgression of choosing the wrong side. The charges, which are they are absolutely an unadorned legal fiction. We are told to believe that the state has these powers over what can be said and what can't be said, the things that can and cannot be said. But what happens if we permit that? Where does that lead? What are we? Can we be said to be free? If even our power to express ourselves, to understand the facts of our world can be fenced off from us, and we look beyond, through the gauze, through the veil, at what could be the facts of the world, but we're not permitted to acquire them. Julian Assange did not accept that, and the charges against him reduced to an allegation to commit the crime of journalism in the first degree. Which is to say, when we look at it applied elsewhere, the same sort of publication of classified material that we see in the New York Times or the Washington Post, aggravated by a conspiracy to accomplish the same, which is simply uncovering an uncomfortable truth. But something distinguishes Julian Assange from the greatest newspapers of our day, and that is his independence. Julian Assange is not a person who will be told no lightly. I remember in the case of 2013, when I came forward and revealed evidence of mass surveillance, which the government of my country had constructed the apparatus of mass surveillance, an entire scheme that spanned the globe, with the participation of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course, the United Kingdom. And when the newspapers of all of these countries began publishing these things, one of the papers who held the archive of material originally included The Guardian, who was headquartered in the United Kingdom, still is. And I remember reading a story. Of course, I wasn't there for it personally. I'm getting this secondhand. Who knows what we can rely on, the state of journalism as it is today. But they were approached by the British state, who said, okay, you've had your fun. You've done enough. Now it's time to stop. And they had to send their archival material away to the United States, to a partner publication, because they no longer believed that they were safe to continue publishing. And they were right. Agents of the British state went to The Guardian. They destroyed their laptop computers. They've got it on film, putting angle grinders to computer chips, trying to erase any trace that these stories had been written from within the confines of the newsroom. Now, Julian was not deterred by that, and he never would be. When you perform the level of surveillance against a person that has clearly been performed and is being performed, even today, certainly in prison, against Julian Assange, you understand at least something about that character. You understand what the breaking point is. You know what it'll take to make them bend. And he didn't bend. He will break before he does. He has consistently and continuously dared to speak the unspeakable in the face of opposition, in the face of power, and that is a remarkable and rare thing. That is the reason that Julian Assange sits in prison today. If you love the truth, as I think everyone here does, you wouldn't be listening to this, you wouldn't be watching this, you wouldn't be participating in this, you wouldn't care about this unless something in you told you that something important was happening here. And if you do care, as I think you do, you are a criminal of the same category as Julian Assange. In the eyes of the state, what differentiates you, what divides you from him, is only the degree. We share the same guilt. Each of us share in the crime, and we are unindicted co-conspirators in his quest to raise a lantern in the halls of power. Each of us shares in the forbidden desire to see justice done not merely to the instruments of these darkest moments of the human condition that we've heard about all day here, torture, extrajudicial killings, aggressive war, but to see justice done to their architects. And I have to say here, each of us will also share, and to me it will happen without the faintest regret, in his ultimate fate, if we do not stop what is happening now. What is happening to Julian Assange is a crime, and he must be freed. If we're going to free the world, we have to free Assange. Thank you, and stay free.
Thanks a lot, Edward Snowden, for joining the Belmarsh Tribunal today. I would also add that what is happening to Edward Snowden is also a crime, and similar to what Tariq Ali said at the very start of the Belmarsh Tribunal, he should be considered a true hero in the United States. In other countries, he is already considered a hero. We are reaching the end of today's Belmarsh Tribunal, but we are certainly not reaching the end of this tribunal and our common fight. So before we conclude the tribunal, I just want to announce a few important informations. The first and most important information is that this tribunal early next week will publish verdicts and findings, which will be public. You can follow it on the Progressive International website. Also, I have to mention that already tomorrow on Saturday there will be a hopefully big march for Julian Assange, starting at 1 p.m. At the BBC Broadcasting House at Portland Place, and marching to the High Court, the Strand. Then next week, during the extradition hearing, which is happening on Wednesday and Thursday, 27th, 28th of October, there will be a massive protest outside of the Royal Court of Justice where the extradition hearing is taking place. And I also want to thank all the members of the tribunal who granted us their precious time and their precious testimonies. I want to thank the team of the Progressive International who made this happen. I want to thank our partners from DiEM25, Courage Foundation, and Novara Media, and also the Church House for providing the space for this tribunal. But before we end, I also have to mention that the work of the Progressive International and the work of the Belmarsh Tribunal depends on small donations. So please, everyone who is watching this, subscribe to the Progressive International and consider helping and supporting our work, which is definitely not ending today. Also, before we end, I just got a message from our common member of the tribunal, Eyal Weizmann, who would love to share an important information about atrocities which are happening as we speak.
Is that on? Okay. As we're speaking here about the horrendous silencing of Julian Assange, his characterization as a terrorist, we've heard that in the break. I've received messages that our friends and partners in Palestine, the oldest and still largest human rights organization, Al-Haq, has been currently designated as a terrorist organization by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So Al-Haq has literally exposed thousands of human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories. Its crime is pursuing Israel in the international tribunals and supporting the ICC prosecution, the International Criminal Court prosecution. So I think that, you know, it's a reminder that as we are speaking, those kinds of designation and silencing is going on.
Thank you, Eyal. And instead of me closing the tribunal, let me invite my dear friend and the original member of the Sartre Russell Tribunal, Tariq Ali, to conclude this tribunal today.
I think it's been an extremely useful meeting, a wide variation of views, very useful information which has been provided for us. And I am particularly happy myself that there are members of Parliament present, because this is a body which has very few members who in fact defend and fight for things they should be fighting. So very grateful to Jeremy, Apsana, Comrade Bergen, John McDonnell, for making it possible to come here. We need, I would have thought, some bill at least presented in Parliament demanding, even if it's just signed by people, demanding Julian's immediate release after the trial, if it takes place. So with that, I declare this session of the tribunal closed. Thank you.